Okay, let's unpack this. Why do we like what we like? It sounds simple, right?
Uh,
But think about it across products, art, ideas, people. What makes something catch on, become a hit? It's this age-old question.
Absolutely. For centuries, thinkers have wrestled with it. Is there some kind of formula, for popularity,
Oh, yeah.
for that pull we feel towards certain things?
And the fascinating material we've gathered for this deep dive, well, it points to a powerful answer, something that seems almost contradictory at first glance.
That's the tension I found so interesting in this stack of sources, too.
Yeah. On one hand, we live in a world seemingly obsessed with new. Advertisers scream it at us.
Oh, yeah.
One study found new was the most common word in advertising copy. We're kind of conditioned to crave the latest upgrade, the fresh trend, the next big thing. There's this whole cult of novelty we feel pressured to join.
But then you turn the page in the research and you run smack into one of the most fundamental, really robust findings in all of psychology. The mere exposure effect.
Mere exposure effect,
Yeah.
right?
This theory, it stood the test of time, basically states that simply being exposed to a stimulus repeatedly over time makes you develop a preference for it.
Mm.
Not because it's objectively better or anything like that, but just because it's familiar.
And you really do see it everywhere once you start looking, don't you? Like, we might enjoy discovering completely novel music, but the songs we return to again and again, the ones that become anthems,
Wow.
they often rely on familiar chord structures, familiar rhythms, timbers we've heard before.
Or look at blockbuster movies.
Yeah.
Year after year, the top earners are dominated by sequels, prequels, remakes, adaptations of books or comics.
Totally. Familiar stories.
We show up in droves for stories we essentially already know. Familiarity is a massive draw.
It even applies to how you see yourself. Studies show people often prefer the reflection they see in the mirror over a photograph of themselves.
Right, the mirror image.
Why?
Yep.
Not just vanity, apparently. Your face has slight asymmetries. The version you see most often, the one that is most familiar to you, well, that's the mirrored version.
Unless you're, constantly photographed professionally.
Exactly. That's the face your brain has been exposed to the most. It feels right.
And there's even an evolutionary angle suggested in some of the material.
Ah, okay.
Imagine being an early human. If you recognized a plant or animal, if it was familiar, that meant it hadn't killed your ancestors.
Right.
Well, good point.
Familiar equals safe.
Familiarity was literally a survival signal. So we might just be hardwired to prefer the familiar because historically it kept us alive.
So here's the core puzzle this creates for anyone trying to put something new out into the world, a product, an idea, a piece of art, anything, really.
Yeah, the big challenge.
If people have this deep-seated preference for things that are like old things, how do you ever make something genuinely new appealing? How do you balance that powerful human comfort with familiarity and that undeniable, even if sometimes fearful, pull towards surprise?
That fundamental tension is exactly where a truly fascinating figure from the 20th century enters the picture. A man who seemed to understand this psychological tightrope intuitively.
Raymond Loewy.
Exactly. The stories describe Raymond Loewy arriving in industrial Manhattan as a young French orphan in the 1920s.
Wow.
He looked out of the city expecting elegance like Paris and instead saw, well, ugliness, to put it bluntly.
He wasn't impressed.
Not at all. And right then, he apparently made it his mission to beautify America, to make the products and designs of the industrial age appealing to people.
And he absolutely delivered. I mean, his fingerprints are all over iconic 20th century design.
Well, for sure.
The streamlined Pennsylvania Railroad GG1 locomotive, the classic 1953 Studebaker car, that sleek modern Greyhound bus.
Even everyday items like the Coca-Cola fountain or that familiar egg-shaped pencil sharpener we all had.
Right, and logos for giants like Exxon and USPS, stuff we still see.
And he even famously redesigned Air Force One for President Kennedy, apparently sketching it out right there on the floor of the Oval Office.
You're no kidding.
That's the story. And that design basically endures today. This wasn't just styling. This was about creating things that people loved and accepted on a massive scale.
So what was his secret? What did this man, dubbed in one account as Don Draper meets Steve Jobs for the 20th century, understand about human nature?
He had a theory. A concept that cuts right to the heart of that familiarity-novelty paradox we were talking about.
Okay.
He called it Maya.
May-Y, like the civilization, M-A-Y-A.
No, M-A-Y-A, exactly. It stands for most advanced yet acceptable.
Most advanced yet acceptable. Okay.
Loewy realized that human beings are constantly caught between two competing desires. We have neophilia The love of the new, the drive to explore and discover and advance.
Right, that pull towards the shiny and new.
And neophobia, the fear of the too new, the too different. That deep conservativeness tied to our preference for the familiar.
The don't rock the boat instinct.
Precisely. And Lowy's genius insight, which has been borne out by research in countless fields since, is that success lies at the intersection of these two forces.
The sweet spot.
The sweet spot. Products, ideas, anything you want people to embrace must hit optimally new, but not too new. Most advanced, yet acceptable.
So, to make something familiar popular, add surprise.
You got it. Add a touch of surprise. But crucially, the other way around. To make something surprising popular, you have to make it familiar. Anchor it somehow.
Familiar surprise. That really captures it. Let's dive into the examples this material provides, because it seems like it's everywhere once you look for it.
Absolutely. Take technology. Like Spotify's Discover Weekly playlist feature.
Oh yeah, I use that.
So initially, the team building it thought, okay, this is about discovery. Let's fill these playlists with only music the listener has never heard before. Pure novelty.
Which logically makes sense, right? You want to discover, you need new stuff.
Right. But during early testing, a bug in the algorithm accidentally mixed in some songs or artists the listeners already knew and liked. Some familiar stuff.
Uh-oh. Or maybe,
Exactly. When they fixed the bug, removing the familiar tracks and making the playlist purely new music, engagement plummeted. People stopped listening as much. The advanced or surprising new music was only really acceptable when it was presented alongside those familiar anchors.
That's a perfect, almost accidental illustration of Mayo. You needed the acceptable, the familiar songs to make the advanced, the new songs palatable.
It's not just consumer tech either. We see this principle even in something as seemingly objective as academic research.
Really? How so?
Well, there was this fascinating 2014 study out of Harvard and Northwestern. They looked at how researchers evaluate grant proposals submitted to the NIH, the National Institutes of Health.
Okay. High-stakes stuff.
Definitely. They coded dummy proposals based on how novel the ideas were, like how much they departed from current thinking, and had experienced researchers score them.
And you'd assume the most cutting-edge, totally novel ideas would score highest, right? I mean, that's the goal of research, pushing boundaries.
That's what you'd think.
Yeah.
But the preference pattern wasn't linear. It actually formed an upside-down U-curve when plotted against novelty.
An upside-down U, meaning?
Meaning proposals that were too familiar, just rehashing old ideas, weren't rated highly. Okay, fine. But crucially, neither were the proposals that were too novel, too far outside the existing framework.
Hitting that neophobia wall again. Too scary, too different.
Exactly. The most preferred proposals, the ones that got the highest scores, were those rated as optimally familiar, advanced, yet acceptable, fitting the Mayo principle perfectly.
So even academic hit papers, the ones that get cited in influence fields, tend to live in the sweet spot of familiar surprise.
That's what the study suggests. They have to be advanced, but still acceptable within the current paradigm.
Okay, so if our brains are wired this way, with this deep comfort in the familiar, why does fashion even exist? The material points out that historically, clothing styles barely changed for centuries. People wore togas for generations.
Right. What drives change if we prefer what we know?
Yeah.
It seems counterintuitive, but the pattern seems to follow Mayo here too. The material uses a great analogy. Imagine a magical store. In this store, every piece of clothing ever designed exists. They all cost the same, and there's no advertising pushing trends.
Total freedom of choice.
Total freedom. You'd still see fashion cycles, the theory goes, because the market for first names works exactly like this.
First names. How are first names like a magical clothing store? That seems like a jump.
Well, think about it. All potential names exist out there, right? They cost the same nothing. And there's no marketing department telling you Sophia is the hot name this year.
True. It's more organic.
Yet, first names follow distinct hype cycles. They rise and fall in popularity with remarkable predictability.
And the sociologist Stanley Levison's theory on this, which is mentioned in the material, aligns perfectly with Mareka. Parents aren't just picking randomly.
No, they're seeking familiar surprises.
Familiar surprises and names. Okay, give me an example.
Okay, take the name Samantha. The sources show it was moderately popular in the 80s, maybe like the 30th most common girl's name.
So you'd heard it, but it wasn't everywhere.
Exactly. Familiar, but not too common. That familiar but not everywhere quality apparently drove its popularity up until it peaked as the #2 most popular girl's name in 1992. Huge.
But then it dropped off.
It did, because 5 years later, guess what? All those Samanthas were in kindergarten together.
Ah, however,
It lost the surprise element of familiar surprise. It became too common, too familiar, and parents started shifting towards names that offered the next optimal balance.
you can kind of feel this intuitively too. Like siblings named Michael, Emily, and Sarah sound like a natural set.
hmm
And maybe Xanthippe, Prairie Rose, and Esmeralda sound like a different kind of natural set.
Right, they have their own familiarity pattern.
But putting a Chad among the second group or a Xanthippe among the first group feels jarring.
Exactly. We have a taste for familiar patterns in names, even if we don't consciously think about it.
The most striking example of this in the material, though, is the naming patterns among Black American baby girls since the 1960s.
This is a really powerful illustration of Maya in action in culture.
How so?
Well, the sources point out that before the 60s, naming patterns for Black and white Americans were actually quite similar. But then you see what's been called a great forking, where distinct patterns emerged.
Okay.
And the material focuses specifically on the rise of names, using the La prefix, Latonia, Lakeisha, etc., which were almost unheard of before the late 60s.
And there's an incredible sequence there, right? The order matter.
It's amazing how orderly it is. Starting in 1967, you see this very specific progression of 8 distinct La names, peaking in popularity one after the other. Latonia, then Latonia, then Latasha, Latoya, Latrice, Lakeisha. Then Lakeisha peaked again with a slightly different spelling perhaps, and finally Latricia.
Wow, one after another.
Yeah, and each name isn't totally random, it's clearly a play on what came before it. Taking the familiar La prefix and structure, and just slightly changing the suffix or the spelling to create something new, but not too new. Familiar surprise.
That's a vivid, real-world example of familiar surprise driving a significant cultural trend. Just fascinating.
Absolutely. It shows how these principles operate even without a central designer like Lowy.
So this May principle shows up in products, tech, academia, names, and the material even applies it to something as tricky as political persuasion, especially now in such a polarized age.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting and, frankly, quite practical.
Okay. How does May apply to arguing about politics?
Well, think about how we usually try to persuade someone who holds different views. The common mistake, according to this thinking, is to start from our own foundational values or code of ethics.
Right. You argue from what you believe is most important.
Exactly. So a liberal arguing with a conservative might say, this policy is wrong because it's cruel, appealing to a value of compassion. A conservative arguing with a liberal might say, this policy is wrong because it leads to socialism, appealing to a value of liberty or free markets.
And that often just bounces
Imbalance.
off, right? Because the other person doesn't share that same primary value system or they prioritize it differently.
Precisely. You're starting from a position of deep unfamiliarity. You're essentially trying to sell something surprising your conclusion based on principles that aren't acceptable or familiar to them. It's like trying to sell a completely alien product.
So it fails the Mayo test, not acceptable.
Exactly. So the Mayo approach in this context suggests flipping that script. Start with their familiar, acceptable values.
Start on their turf.
Piggyback on what they already hold dear. For example, the material suggests that if a liberal is talking to a Trump supporter, instead of starting with a value, the listener might not prioritize as highly, like, say, compassion for immigrants in that specific argument.
Okay.
They could start by acknowledging and even praising a value the listener does hold strongly, maybe patriotism or loyalty or the importance of hard work and service to the country. These are familiar, acceptable principles within that listener's framework.
Okay, so you establish that common ground first, the familiar part.
Yes, you build that initial connection on familiar ground. Then you might gently introduce the advanced or surprising element, your specific point about the policy or issue at hand, by asking how Trump's specific actions or policies align with those shared familiar values you just agreed on.
Ah, so you frame your critique using their values.
Exactly. It's not about scoring debate points. It's about making your perspective slightly more acceptable, slightly less alien, by grounding it in their existing framework. Now, the materials is clear. This isn't some kind of magic bullet conversion tactic.
Right, people don't change their minds instantly.
No. But it suggests you'll get a lot farther than by starting with principles they fundamentally reject. All debate, all persuasion is really a form of ideological advertising. And to be effective, to stick, it needs to be maya familiar enough to be accepted, advanced enough to be considered.
That application feels incredibly relevant today. Wow. Okay, let's loop back to Raymond Loewy for one final story from the material. His last major design challenge, this is amazing, was creating the interior habitat for the first NASA space orbital.
Talk about an unfamiliar environment. Deep space.
The ultimate surprising advanced setting, right?
Absolutely. And though he made various technical contributions, tweaks to the interior, but his most enduring design choice for that orbital habitat was incredibly simple, almost profound in its simplicity.
What did she do?
He cut a hole in the side and put it in a window.
A window, that's it. Seriously.
That's basically it, and it's a perfect, powerful illustration of Maya. Think about it. You're in the most advanced, unfamiliar environment imaginable, hurtling through the vacuum of deep space.
Utterly alien.
And Loewy's most famous contribution is a window. A window that shows you the profound, surprising new universe outside, yes. But through that same window, you also see home, Earth.
Oh, wow.
It made the overwhelmingly unfamiliar just slightly more acceptable, more human, by connecting it to something fundamentally, beautifully familiar, home.
A window to a new world that also shows you home. That really encapsulates the power of balancing the advanced and the acceptable. That's beautiful.
It really is. And the material even takes this idea further, suggesting Maya can offer insight into helping people from diverse backgrounds connect better and build understanding.
Okay, so going beyond products and ideas now, right into human connection itself.
Right. The discussion brings up the concept of sensitive periods from developmental psychology.
Sensitive periods.
Yeah, the idea that our core tastes, our preferences, what feels familiar to us, a lot of that solidifies relatively early in life and tends not to change dramatically after a certain age, maybe in our 40s or 50s. Our fundamental sense of familiarity gets set.
So simply trying to remediate or change deeply ingrained adult perspectives by, I don't know, showing them diversity PowerPoints. It might have limitations.
That seems to be the implication, especially when thinking about complex issues like justice, tolerance, and multicultural understanding. It suggests it's not just about adult education or persuasion efforts, important as those might be.
So what else?
It suggests maybe a cradle-to-grave strategy. The material highlights the idea that fostering understanding and acceptance isn't only about changing minds later in life, but it's also crucially about building communities.
Right.
Where people from different backgrounds, different ideologies, colors, creeds actually live together, interact regularly, creating that sense of familiarity and shared experience organically, right from a young age.
Building that acceptable, familiar ground early on through proximity and interaction, making difference less different.
Exactly. It shifts the focus partly from purely trying to persuade people out of prejudice later to recognizing that building acceptance is deeply tied to building familiarity in the first place, starting in the places where we live and grow up.
This deep dive has been incredible, really, from designing iconic cars and logos to shaping baby names, academic hits, political persuasion, and even thinking about how we build more connected communities.
It touches so many areas.
The principle of May, finding that sweet spot between the advanced or surprising and the acceptable or familiar, it really does seem like a fundamental formula for how we embrace the world around us. Or reject it.
It's a powerful lens once you start using it. It helps make sense of a lot of things.
So here's something for you listening to carry forward. Look around your world and ask yourself, where else do you see Maya in action? How do the things you encounter, whether it's a new song you hear, a piece of technology you try, a social media trend that pops up, or even a conversation with someone different from you, how do they balance the new and the familiar to gain acceptance, your acceptance?
Yeah. How does that play out for you personally?
Think about how this principle might inform your own creativity, maybe your communication, or simply how you understand why certain things catch on while others just fizzle out. It's a fascinating way to look at the world.